who is Dr. Amity James. Amity is a senior lecturer at the School of Accounting, Economics and Finance in the Faculty of Business and Law at Curtin. She's an experienced housing researcher in the areas of housing and ageing, housing affordability and housing policy. She previously held a research fellowship at the University of Queensland, and she has either led or been involved in many research projects funded by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, or AHURI, who are great colleagues of ours, and we always recommend you look at the AHURI's work, and Curtin is a very important part of AHURI. Amity was awarded New Researcher of the Year in 2018 in Curtin's Faculty of Business and Law. And nowadays, with her research team, she's examining the experiences of older adults living in the private rental sector, as well as housing aspirations and residential mobility in later life. And Amity and her colleagues work closely with people who have lived experience in these areas. And in fact, Amity is involved in a number of steering committees locally that champion for the rights of older renters and those in precarious housing. So she certainly knows what she's talking about, and she lives it and breathes it, as well as researching it. So thank you very much, Amity, for agreeing to be our speaker at today's Curtin Corner, and we're really looking forward to your presentation. So I'll hand it over to you. If we can see you on the screen in a second. I think you're coming up now. Great.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me this afternoon. I'm just going to share some slides with you. There we are. Hopefully you can see those or see that first slide up there. Great.
It's all good. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. As John said, this afternoon I'm going to be talking to you about housing, and in particular the housing aspirations of older Australians. Now, when I say older Australians, I'm referring to those aged 55 years and over. Now, some of you might balk at the idea of 50 being categorised as being old. However, the reason that we use this cutoff or this age in the context of housing is because of the decisions that people make in relation to their housing and retirement around that stage. So let's talk about housing for a moment. Let's have a look. If I was to ask you to describe your house, you might say something like, it has 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, an activity room, and you might say something about the land area. Or you might say a 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom home with formal lounge, formal dining, and say something about the carport under the main roof. Or you might say that it's an old farmhouse that's been done up a little. The floors are uneven, it's quite small, 3 bedrooms, a large lounge, and a kitchen. We often think about our housing in terms of these shelter components, the number of bedrooms, the land area, the dwelling type, for example. However, the concept of housing is much more complex. And this complexity is actually one of the reasons that I really like and I really enjoy researching the area of housing, because housing intersects with so many aspects of our life, with the lifestyles that we want to lead, with our ambitions, with our expectations. And so, as well as providing shelter, housing can be thought of or seen as a springboard for being able to achieve a whole range of goals in life. Now, before I go into the research that I'm going to talk to you about today, I want to give you a little bit of a background on some of the key things that influence or shape the work that we do in terms of housing for older people. So, like many nations, Australia has an ageing population. So there's a projected increase in the number of older Australians from around 6.4 million to 4.9 million. So 6.4 million in 2016 to 9.4 million in 36. The other factor is that older Australians form a very diverse cohort. They come from 2 distinct birth cohorts. So there's the pre-war cohort as well as the baby boomers. Now, these 2 cohorts have a very distinctive and very diverse ranges of experience throughout life. And these experiences are likely to shape, again, very distinctive and diverse housing expectations for the future. The other factor that needs to be taken into consideration or acknowledged is that traditionally in Australia, as households have reached retirement age, many are owning their homes or have owned their homes outright. This is no longer the case. We're seeing an increase in the number of people entering retirement without having full home ownership. This is often the case for women. these households are finding themselves in the private rental sector. So we've got a growing number of private renters who are in their retirement years. Retirement housing for older people is not always affordable if you're outside the workforce, and it's not always secure as well. So it's in the context of these three key themes that we undertake the research. And it's from this that we know and can understand that there are going to be significant challenges in delivering suitable housing for older Australians into the future. Now, when we set out to do our research, little was known about the shelter and non-shelter aspirations of these cohorts. So we asked ourselves, what do Australians want from their housing? So in what type of housing do they want to live? Where do they aspire to live? And we also want to know how and where and why housing aspirations are being constrained. And then what can be done to ensure that aspirations are achieved. I'd like to take a few moments just to tell you a little bit about the multidimensional concept of aspirations. Fundamentally, aspirations represent our preferences and our expectations. They're informed by the social, structural, and economic context in which we live. And there are three main components to aspirations research. There's cognitive, affective, and behavioural. So the cognitive relates to the extent to which a person knows an opportunity exists. Affective is their preference for this opportunity, and behavioural refers to their intention to act towards this opportunity. So individuals and households aim to keep these three components balanced to avoid a state of cognitive dissonance. That is, having inconsistencies between what they believe or what their opinions are and then their behaviours on the other hand. So for example, we can use a housing example. A household might become aware of suburb A, cognitive. They like the idea of living in suburb A, which is affective, and they make the decision to move to suburb A, behavioural. And so you can see that there's a balance there between the three components, and they have met their aspirations. If the household, however, becomes aware of limitations that might reduce their ability to meet their aspirations, they may adjust one of these components. So, for example, they might realise that the dwellings in suburb A are beyond their financial means, cognitive. They therefore adjust their preference for living in suburb A. They decide they don't want to live there anymore. And therefore, that's the affective, and then they decide not to move. So the decision is made not to move, and that's behavioural. So in the research that I'm going to talk to you about today, aspirations relate to the shelter and non-shelter attributes associated with housing. And what we're looking at is the difference between where people are currently living and where their ideal housing is. So where do they aspire to live? And the difference between these two is going to be conceptualised as the housing aspirations gap. So we're looking at, on the one hand, where Australians want to live in terms of their housing, and on the other hand, what's that gap between where they are and where they would like to be. So as John mentioned, this work and much of my research is funded by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. I've got two projects up there. The majority of what I'm going to speak to you about today comes from the one on the left there, the Older Australians and the Housing Aspirations Gap. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors on this project, Stephen Rowley, Wendy Stone, Sharon Parkinson, Angela Spinney, and Maggie Reynolds as well. So the Older Australians and the Housing Aspiration Gap is one of three projects that sit under an overarching umbrella of a larger program of research, which was looking at how existing and innovative policy can be harnessed to assist lower income Australians achieve their housing aspirations across the life course. So one project looked at the younger cohort, one at the midlife, and the one that I led looked at the older cohort there. Now, a related project that I worked on or led was the effective downsizing options for older Australians. You'll see how it's related to you'll see how the projects are related in just a moment when I talk about the methodology. But it's worthwhile talking about both of them here today because they do sit nicely together. With the Older Australians Aspiration Gap project, what we started out by doing was we did a number of focus groups. That was to inform the development of an online survey called the Australian Housing Aspirations Survey. This survey captured the responses of 7,300 households across Australia, and 2,400 of those were older Australians, so 55 years and over. Our survey asked questions relating to the short and longer term housing aspirations of the cohorts, including the housing attributes which were important to people, the constraints that they were under, trade-offs that they might make, and then also understand how these link together to support or to their wider life goals, both pre and post-retirement. We then, in order to be able to explore some of the themes, or actually I might just go back one step. Within the survey, when our older Australians commenced the survey, they were also given an additional module. So they got a module around the effective downsizing project. So we then explored the theme of downsizing with our older Australians within the Housing Aspirations Survey. And then we undertook a series of telephone interviews with later life Australians in metropolitan and regional WA, New South Wales and Western Australia. So there was quite a large program of research that went on for this particular project. And I'm going to share with you next the framework that we use to understand what households want from their housing. So you can see at the left-hand side there, the factors shaping current housing outcomes. So these include a range of past experiences that households have had. So employment, whether they're now retired or not, opportunities for wealth and asset accumulation, their health, their relationship statuses. You'll also notice that tenure is in there as well, and it's listed there because of the way that it influences housing choices and opportunities. It's quite an important factor, as you're going to see this afternoon. Now, as households age, their needs and priorities and expectations of their housing bundle also change. So at different stages of life, these factors, affordability, dwelling size, security, control, independence, become more or less important. The combination of these factors within the housing bundle then determine people's housing or households' housing aspirations. And you can see that there. What the framework did then was it compared the current housing outcomes against the household's ideal housing outcomes or aspirations to reveal that housing aspiration gap. Now, what this framework allowed us to do was look at not only what the housing aspirations of this cohort are, but this is how we started to understand what the gaps are and understand why they're occurring and for whom they're occurring as well. And this is what's important from a policy perspective in particular. So what were the factors which influenced the housing aspirations of our older Australians? Let's look first at the non-shelter aspects. So these are related to the values or important aspects which intercept with housing. We found that full home ownership was the most important aspect that later life Australians wanted from their dwelling. This is particularly for those aged between 65 and 74 years. This desire for home ownership, or this factor influencing their aspirations, was underpinned by the stability and security that home ownership offers us in terms of that tenure security. The interviews revealed that the financial returns were actually less important to some people than the ability to pass on an inheritance. So this tended to be more the respondents or the interviewees with full home ownership, or those in shared ownership arrangements. Another factor shaping the housing aspirations was the desire to remain independent. Now, interviewees in particular felt that a little bit of support from their children would be okay, but to be living with them or dependent on them for housing would be considered by them a loss of independence. Those in the private rental sector also indicated the importance of employment. And many of the interviewees had become aware that they are depending on that income from their current employment to maintain their current home. And without that employment, they may be forced to move in order to find more affordable housing. And family is another major non-shelter factor shaping aspirations. Around a third of 55 to 64-year-olds respondents from the survey still had adult children living with them. So this included dependent adult children, grandchildren, or independent adult children. So obviously these extra members of the household were going to be shaping the housing aspirations of these families. We look at the shelter component. So this is anything to do with the physical dwelling or the location, for example. We found that where participants live, that is the location, was one of the most valued aspects of housing. When people talked about their housing, we asked them about their housing, they sometimes started by talking about where they lived and their location rather than the dwelling itself. They spoke of things such as the safety and security of their area, the good, often walkable access to services such as health, shopping, public transport, recreational facilities, public open space, and then also proximity to family and friends. Now, housing attributes were important, in particular the number of bedrooms, and then this was followed by the quality of internal and external spaces as well as the security of their buildings, and then the type of dwelling. Outdoor space was quite a significant factor influencing their aspirations, because we found that outdoor space is really important, but it's not necessarily the size of outdoor space that's important, it's the functionality of it. So too much garden was considered to be unmanageable, but an absence of outdoor space was equally as undesirable. So people were looking for something where they could, I think there was one quote where someone said that they wanted just enough garden for their roses and to be able to sit in the sun and enjoy a cup of tea. So outdoor space is really important. The longer term, older Australians of all ages and in all tenures wanted to have somewhere safe and secure to call home. And they want to have control over that home. Okay, so let's move on to the housing ideals. So these are the aspirations of the housing attributes, the pieces that make up the physical home, I guess. So these are the shelter components. At the very outset of the survey, we asked participants to outline or indicate their ideal housing. And we found that regardless of tenure, 80% of older Australians want to live in a home that they own. So that theme of tenure is coming up again and again. And you can see there on the table that older Australians preferred to live in middle to outer suburbs, but there's also a strong preference to live in small regional towns, particularly among those aged 55 to 74 years. 2/3 of respondents preferred to live in a standalone house, and you can see the breakdowns there by tenure when we look at dwelling type. So those in the private rental sector and the social housing sector were more open to those perhaps more diverse housing types there. Around half of the respondents wanted to live in a home with 3 bedrooms or 2 bedrooms. So the housing ideal, the housing aspirations is not for small homes by our older Australians. They're for detached 2 and 3 bedroom homes. And this is quite a nice time to just jump over to the downsizing project and some of the findings from there. So in this research, when we talked to people about the concept of downsizing, they were explaining to us in the, particularly the interviews, that downsizing was not about necessarily moving to somewhere, to a dwelling that was, it had a reduced number of bedrooms or land area or land value. Rather, it was about moving to a dwelling that is appropriate for their household at this stage of life. So maybe downsizing isn't the right word, maybe right-sizing is the right word here. So while downsizing did sometimes include a reduction in dwelling size, it actually points to a housing aspiration. It's around making the house more manageable. it often represented a financially beneficial change, and also a move that enabled people to potentially age in place. So when we're aging in place, we're not necessarily just aging in the exact home that that our families grew up in, but it could be aging in place in the community. So remaining within that same community so that you still, you know where your local supermarket is, your local GP and pharmacy. You can say hi to the butcher and they can respond to you by name. There's that, that sense of community. So that's still aging in place. But for some, downsizing was also about a safeguard against moving into early residential care as well. So being in a home that supported their aspiration to remain independent in that home for a long period of time. Now, of the 2,400 respondents, or 55 years and over, to the Australian Housing Aspirations Survey, we found that 26% had already downsized, and a further 29% had considered downsizing. So if we consider these together, we can actually see that there's an appetite for downsizing among older Australians. So this is part of their aspirations. We also found that some would-be downsizers couldn't move because of a lack of available options. Now, around 2/3 of households who had downsized had spare bedrooms. So we know that the aspiration isn't for small homes. So the spare bedrooms wasn't that much of a surprise. But as participants, particularly in the interviews and the focus groups, started to explain what they use their spare bedrooms for, hobby rooms, offices, dedicated grandchildren rooms, guest rooms, room for a carer, it became increasingly difficult to think of them as being spare. Rather, you can start to see them as a very necessary component of the dwelling. However, policy rationales for downsizing are often centred around the underutilisation of dwellings. So it's defined by the ABS as being the ratio of usual residents relative to the number of available bedrooms. So if there are 2 people living in a 4-bedroom home, it's considered as an underutilised dwelling. So housing aspirations for this cohort aren't pointing to those small homes, and downsizing doesn't necessarily result in full dwelling utilisation. So one of the things that this research pointed out, that there is a disconnect between the policy rationale and perhaps the perceptions of many older Australians in terms of those spare bedrooms. But we'll jump back to the Housing Aspirations project here. So in order to understand that aspirations gap, we began by asking households or looking at whether or not the households that older Australians were living in would meet their longer or short-term and longer housing aspirations and their needs. In many respects, what we found was positive. So over 90% of older Australians are living in dwellings which currently meet their needs. And this is at least in the short term. So it means that the housing aspiration gap for older Australians in the short term is actually quite small. In the longer term, however, it's larger, with around 70% of survey respondents currently living in housing that won't meet their long-term housing aspirations. But the important finding was that where the housing aspiration does exist, it's being experienced by very specific groups. And that's the renters, so both private and social housing renters. These were the groups that tended to be in housing that didn't necessarily meet their longer term housing aspirations. So what aspects of housing aren't meeting aspirations? When we compared the housing that older Australians are living in at the moment with their ideal, we then looked at the difference or the gaps, so the housing aspiration gap that emerged. And this table shows those gaps and how they're the gaps by housing attribute and also by tenure there as well. What is evident at the outset is that most of the gaps are actually quite small, so less than 9% of the total cohort. The medium gaps are those where between 10 and 19% of the total population were not achieving their ideal outcomes, and the large gaps were where 20% or more of the total population were not achieving their ideal outcomes. If we look first at location, regardless of tenure, we found that there is an unmet demand for being in a small to medium town. So it's obviously smaller for the homeowners, but you can see that medium unmet demand for private renters and also social housing renters. In terms of dwelling type, there's an unmet demand, particularly in the social housing sector, for those separate homes, for those separate houses. So really large, so it was more than 20% there who were not living in dwellings that met their ideal needs. If we look at the number of bedrooms, there's another clear gap there. So there's a preference for those 2 to 3 bedroom homes. And what we found was that the homeowners and the private renters were tending to be moving away from the 4 and 5 bedroom homes, wanting to move towards the 2 to 3 bedroom homes. Whereas that medium unmet demand in the social housing sector actually represented people wanting to move from 1 bedroom apartments to 2 to 3 bedroom homes. So there's a bit of a distinction there. And finally, when we look at tenure, there's a significant aspiration gap there for the renters, for all of our renters in the private rental sector and in the social housing sector as well. Some of the social housing sector respondents would like to move to the private rental sector or would be happy to move there. So the housing aspirations gap for older Australians is not large, but it is more evident for those who are renting rather than for homeowners. Now, some respondents were really confident that they'd actually be able to meet their housing aspirations in the not too distant future. So what we did was we explored the barriers being faced by those who didn't think that they'd be able to meet their aspirations. And the main barrier to achieving long-term housing aspirations were financial. So things like accessing and servicing a loan, saving for a deposit, maintaining employment, along with health issues as well. So the ability to maintain employment was a direct barrier to older Australians in the private rental sector. So as I said earlier, without employment, the cost of housing is likely to force them to move in search of more affordable accommodation. Another barrier was discrimination, and this was particularly reported by Indigenous Australians. Several participants talked about the racism that they or their family or friends had experienced and the barrier that it had had to attaining housing aspirations. And there's a quote here that really shows the length that this private rental tenant had to go to in order to access her tenancy. So she had to get a letter of verification of who she was and whether she was trustworthy. And she says, I've still got those letters from the mayor. And then she had to get a letter from the local member of parliament. Now, this does go back 15 years ago, but we've heard things more recently that suggest that the same level of or the same discrimination is occurring at the moment. So she really had to demonstrate that she was trustworthy and would be able to maintain the house. Last barrier, or the other barrier, was limited housing options, particularly for older Australians in the private rental sector, and to an extent in the social housing sector. So private rental tenants often spoke about a lack of affordable housing options, particularly in regional areas, and I think that's quite important to note. While public housing tenants often express frustration at one-bedroom apartments, they explained that their homes did not allow them to undertake the parts of their lifestyle which were important to them. So by having a one-bedroom home, you can't easily have your grandchildren to stay over. If you're unwell, it's difficult to have a carer to stay. There are limited space for hobbies such as sewing or having a dedicated office space, for example. And the other thing was that the homes often came with limited dining and kitchen facilities, which reduced the tenants' ability to be able to entertain their family and friends in the way that they would like to. So catering for these non-shelter housing aspirations is fundamentally important to ensuring the health and well-being of our older population. And understanding these barriers is really important from a policy perspective, because it starts to provide a platform from which we can find solutions to bridge that small but still significant gap. We also asked those households who were living in homes which didn't suit their longer term needs if they were actively planning to achieve their housing aspirations. What the data shows, you can see there really quite clearly, is that these households are generally not planning for the future. So homeowners and private renters followed similar levels of planning there, and social housing tenants were the least active planners. We found that those aged between 65 and 74 were doing the least planning, and those in the younger cohort, the 55 to 64-year-olds, were actually doing the most. And that's part of the reason why we incorporate that cohort into this research. Now, when asked why they are not planning, homeowners were likely to say they hadn't thought about it, while those in the private rental sector and the social housing sectors were more likely to respond that there was no point because I'll never meet my aspirations. What became clear in the interviews was that an absence of planning sometimes indicated or masked rather what household or the knowledge that households had about what they should be planning for. So this quote tells us, this person said, I don't know if there's something that I ought to be thinking about or I ought to be planning for. I'm not prepared to say whether I should or shouldn't be planning. She said that she didn't think that she had to do nothing. And the reason she didn't think she had to do nothing, the reason she thought she might have to be doing some planning, was because her husband, who had passed away 4 years earlier, was saying, we're going to have to downsize, we're going to have to make changes. So she had that in her mind, in the back of her mind, saying, I do have to make changes, but she really wasn't sure of what changes might have to be made. Those in the private rental sector and the social housing sector, when their quotes indicated that their lack of planning was a direct consequence of the limited opportunities that they'd had in earlier life. So this private sector tenant had experienced a marriage breakdown, and she'd never owned a property in the past. So she'd never had the opportunity to be able to plan. So as she says there, it's all about, how do I manage the here and now and not having the opportunity and the means to plan ahead for the future? And that's why I'm in the precarious situation I am now in my 60s, because I don't have that behind me. So she didn't have the opportunities in earlier life to be able to, in this case, she was talking about entering home ownership, and she finds herself in a precarious housing situation now. Where planning is occurring, the most common strategy is the investigation of moving to a different dwelling or location. So this is most common among homeowners and private renters, much more so than the social housing tenants there. We also found that a proportion of homeowners and private renters were saving for a deposit. So in the case of private renters, saving for the deposit, but the homeowners, this was a strategy that was assisting them to maintain their home ownership. And then we found a greater proportion of homeowners over private renters and social housing renters were investigating age segregated housing options. So this is like retirement villages or lifestyle villages. Who needs assistance to meet their housing aspirations? Well, it probably doesn't come as a surprise, I'd suggest by now, that double the proportion of tenants in the private rental sector and the social housing sector indicated that they needed help compared to those in home ownership. So this starts to offer us another clear direction for a policy response. Where people indicated that they did need assistance, we investigated their ability to access a number of forms of help which are out there at the moment. The most common forms of help and assistance that households thought they might be able to access were the financial and legal advice, stamp duty relief, and for those in the private rental sector, subsidised rent. Homeowners and purchasers were more confident about accessing the financial and legal advice compared with those in either rental sector. And that's likely associated with the costs to accessing that type of assistance. Respondents from the public housing sector and the community housing sector were more likely to seek access in regard to the shared home ownership products that government offer, particularly here in Western Australia. While the private sector tenants indicated a likelihood of being able to access assistance such as government grants, savings schemes and low deposit home loans, much more so compared to those in other tenures. Let's start to bring these findings together. So there are a range of factors or values which are driving the diverse housing aspirations of older Australians. The type of housing that people want to live in is driven by the desire to remain independent and to be able to achieve a given lifestyle, but also to have control over their home and to access the services which are going to be able to support them to achieve these outcomes. Overwhelmingly, older Australians seek home ownership, and it's more than just the asset component of home ownership. It's the security which home ownership offers. You can do what you like with your own home. You can have a degree of control. You can modify that home as you grow old, and it can also support you to age in place. You're less likely to be forced to move if you own your own home. The location is another very important aspect. From the perspective that it provides access to amenities such as retail, allied health services, cafes, restaurants, leisure, recreational opportunities, as well as proximity to family and friends. And when we explored where older Australians would like to live, we found that preference there for the middle to outer suburbs and small regional towns. Now, our respondents to the survey indicated a preference for living in 2- and 3-bedroom detached dwellings. When we combine these aspirations and we had a look at the downsizing project, we see that there is an appetite for downsizing. So this fits into the aspirations of our older Australians, with close to 2 to 3, or about 2/3 of respondents being interested in adjusting their housing to meet their changing needs of their households. Now, in good news, we said that 70% of survey respondents were in housing that met their long-term goals. However, when we looked at the aspirations that were not being met, we found that there's a specific cohort in our community, particularly those in the private and social sectors, whose aspirations are not being achieved. For this cohort, we found that unmet demand for home ownership, unmet demand in small regional towns, and an unmet demand for detached homes. Again, those a large unmet demand for detached houses, particularly for our social housing tenants, and a small to medium unmet demand for those 2 to 3 bedroom homes. So why is understanding these aspirations and aspirations gaps important? Because balancing this bundle of housing attributes with housing needs and aspirations of our older Australians will enable them to live in housing which supports their goals for later life. So what does this mean for policy? Well, 2/3 of our older renters in the Australian Housing Aspirations Survey had previously been homeowners. Most of these were forced to leave the home ownership tenure and move into the private rental tenure rather than choosing to do so. So they were forced to move. But what this presents us with is an opportunity to provide housing assistance to keep people in their own dwellings within this home ownership structure, rather than support them once they reach the precarious private rental structure. So solutions might include the development of alternative tenure options, such as low-cost, low-deposit home ownership products through shared ownership schemes. Now, we have some of these schemes already here in Australia, and they're other states are starting to open up these opportunities as well. But what we need is schemes that can deliver housing which offers the safety and security and control characteristics that home ownership offers. So government-driven housing cooperatives might be another example of this that could potentially offer a solution. So policies to maintain ownership could potentially also offer long-term savings for government, because we can see that the next step for these households once they leave home ownership is to move into the private rental sector, where households will often be eligible for Commonwealth rent assistance. If those tenancies can't be sustained, the next step for those households is homelessness. So there's a real need to be able to support those households earlier in the continuum. Alongside this, we need reforms that offer longer leases and greater support in the private rental sector, because there is always going to be a cohort of people who cannot enter or cannot sustain home ownership. Now, this sort of support system might be taxes or tax incentives that to landlords to provide for older Australians who are in need. So identified older Australians who need longer term leases, and also the ability to be able to modify the homes that they're living in. Now, the current patterns of housing supply aren't meeting the diverse needs of older Australians. We need much more of that mid-sized product to be able to meet those housing aspirations. So new or alternative dwelling types might be an avenue to start to bridge the security of home ownership with that relative security of the private rental sector. So this is a project that I'm working on at the moment, looking at essentially consumer demand for alternative housing products by our lower income households in precarious housing situations. So although the housing aspiration gap for older Australians is small, it's significant, particularly for those households in the private rental sector and the social housing sector. However, what we've presented or what we've got here in our reports are some opportunities for policy and the community to be able to start to minimise the gap for these cohorts. Thank you.
Thanks, Amity. That's great. Might get you just as that's it. Perfect. We're back on deck. That's great. So that's very good. Thank you very much. Very interesting. We've already got a few questions on Slido, but if anybody would like to go onto Slido, please go to slido.com and put your question in. And some people already put theirs in before me, which is a first. So excellent. They Nick and somebody else put some questions in, which I'll ask in a second. But go to slido.com or alternatively download the app, and our code is JCIPP. Right, so the first couple of questions which were asked a little while back, this sort of may be related, although you can tell me. Anonymous attended a launch of the My Home project in North Fremantle earlier today. Do you know about the My Home project?
Yes.
So maybe you can explain that. So do you believe such villages might encourage more people to downsize or support other people? So what's the My Home project in North Fremantle about?
So the My Home project that I know about is for those who are currently experiencing homelessness. So it's an opportunity for people to be able to exit homelessness. They are prefabricated homes, so beautifully designed prefabricated homes that can be constructed on currently vacant land around the city. So the My Home project has identified places where potential opportunities which are close to public transport, close to shops, allied health facilities, and the idea is to construct these homes on the land, and there's one in Fremantle, to be able to get people to be able to exit homelessness quickly and easily, because it's in recognition of the fact that we have a shortage of housing supply to be able to assist those who are currently homeless.
And is it aimed primarily, is it organised through the state housing? I mean, through Homes West, that sort of thing?
I'm not an expert on it, but I know that there are a lot of players in there. It's being run by an architect, Michelle Blakely. She's the person who's I guess come up with the idea and the main driving force behind it. And then other players have come on board. The one that jumps there are lots of players, and I hesitate to mention any specifically because I can't remember them all. But different members of the community are being able to come in and contribute elements. So the land is coming, I understand, from the state. Although I might be wrong, it might be from the city of Fremantle. But the land is coming from one avenue. The dwellings are coming from another, and I know the landscaping and interior design is coming from another. So people are stepping up. People in the community, which is wonderful, are stepping up to be able to provide housing options for those in crisis situations.
Okay, so just go on to My Home North Fremantle. I'm sure we find out more about it. Nick asks, and you mentioned this a little bit in one of your tables, do you see an increasing role for the retirement living or / village sector in meeting changing demand for seniors housing? So where does retirement villages fit in? Because that seemed to be, it's all the rage. There's so many ads. I mean, I used to get annoyed, when you're over 55 and they'd show you walking down, with the sunset in the background, and thinking, oh, I'm not ready for that yet. So what's the situation there? What's the role of retirement villages or those sort of things?
Well, look, I think it's part of a diverse supply solution. So there's not one solution here to providing housing. We have to look at a lot of different avenues, and retirement villages, lifestyle villages, so those age segregated housing, it is definitely one avenue. We did ask people about it in the survey. Around 8% of our survey respondents were from or were in retirement villages or in age segregated housing. Then I think from memory, around 1/3 of the respondents said that who weren't in that housing said they'd think about going in it. 1/3 said they wouldn't. So around about 8% of our older population across Australia live in retirement villages. And I think that it's a very specific type of housing, and it certainly meets the needs for one cohort of people. It's not going to be for everyone, but no housing solution is going to be for everyone.
I just wondered whether it would be more suitable to those who've already, I mean, you've basically got your 3 tenures and your homeowners who've got more capital already. I mean, it seems to me they're switching from that. Are they the people who are going into retirement villages, the people who've already got houses?
Yeah, for the most part, it will be homeowners who will be moving from the home that they own outside the village to inside the village. But there are a number of villages now that are creating affordable rental options as well. So they're not prolific at the moment, but there are a number of villages that have developed, rather than to purchase in, you rent in as you might in the private rental sector. And so there aren't that many options in terms of the affordability side of things, but that is a growing area.
Sure. Here we go. A couple other questions.
I sat still for too long.
Okay, sure. I mean, this is an unfair question I put down there early on. I mean, what's the trade-off between location and housing type? I mean, if people have the choice, would they rather go to the area they really want to be in, even if the housing type is not what they want, or are they more prepared, or are they more concerned about the housing type in a location they're not prepared to do? I mean, I know they'd obviously want both in their aspirations, but sometimes there is a trade-off between where you want to live and what you want to live in. So when it comes down to that trade-off, which side of the ledger do people tend to fall on?
I'd err on the side of saying they are on the location side. That would be, that more the location side. The location's harder to change. You can modify a dwelling. So, but every household is going to make those trade-offs in a different way. So I guess that's really what's exciting about it. And as your question really demonstrated, that's why housing is such a lovely area to look at, because so many things intersect within just those 4 walls of the house itself. So the location giving access, the dwelling itself giving a potential lifestyle.
Yeah, sure. Okay, here's a couple of questions. One was, are Airbnb dwellings having an adverse effect on senior housing options? Do you know?
That's not something I could comment on, I don't think. Yeah, I really haven't looked at the impact of Airbnb at all on housing. I'm sorry, I can't
Okay.
comment.
I mean, I know that the Bank West Centre has done, Bank West Curtin Economic Centre has done work on Airbnb, I'm pretty sure, which obviously in the context is mainly looked at in the context of tourism. But of course,
Yes.
the issue is, and just thinking about your small towns, especially small tourism towns, I assume what happens is that some people decide not to rent long-term their place out, in Margaret River or wherever, because they want to be able to rent it out short-term on Airbnb, and hence people have a hard time finding places to live in smaller towns. That's where the Airbnb problem is.
Yes, you've pointed out a major issue in terms of regional towns. Particularly those that are tourism-based towns. Margaret River is a very good example. Busselton, Albany, Denmark. They're all places where older private renters there are really in very precarious situations. There's a real lack of social housing in those areas. The state has a few houses in Margaret River, but not a lot. There's not a great deal of community housing in those areas. So people are forced into the private rental sector if they're not homeowners. But as you said, the landlords want to really capitalise on the tourism trade, and so they're offering only short-term leases. And so the lease over summer is obviously very expensive, and then the leases over winter may be slightly less expensive. But it means that our older renters are actually moving quite a lot during a single year. To try and actually access secure housing. I've spoken to lots that are just living in rooms of other people's houses, in caravans, and that's in particular Margaret River. It is a big problem. But in Margaret River, a lot of work is being done to try and mitigate this problem as well, to provide additional housing. So I know there's a lot of research going on at the moment into changing that for people.
Sure. Have you got any comment on build to rent and whether it's suited to seniors' housing needs, especially where longer rental tenures are concerned? You might have to quickly explain what build to rent is as well.
So build to rent is where a developer comes in with the purpose of building an apartment, for example, and has the intention of renting out each of those properties. So rather than selling them on to somebody else, the idea is to rent them out and to get a long-term stable income from that rent rather than from the sale price. I'd say that provided that the build to rent options could be affordable, yes, to those on low incomes. So we're talking about the age pension. As long as it's affordable to that cohort, I'd say it's definitely part of the picture. So the solutions are not single, it's multi-directional, and I'd say that build to rent could definitely be part of that picture.
Sure. This might be more of a comment than a question, but MPs are unlikely to make housing affordable for renters because they want to keep their investment property prices high. Could you please comment on that? I mean, I think there was something in today's paper about an MP who just sold their investment property somewhere and made a good profit, and you read these things all the time. I mean, I guess from a political point of view, I mean, both that nakedly sort of political point of view about politicians themselves, but in terms of political kudos and political, benefit a party gets or parties get. Basically, there's more in it if they look after homeowners than if they look after renters. Is that the problem?
I don't know if it's the problem, but the proportion of homeowners, particularly in this age range, is higher than the renters, even though the renters are a growing group. So there's probably something to be said for the comment there. Yes.
Okay. What's the difference of single elderly with no children compared to couples with children? Are there financial implications in their aspirations in particular? Because you've got the image of the single pensioner, like you said, versus or the couple with no kids, or a single person or a couple with no kids compared to the couples with children. So clearly they're very diverse and different. So how do they compare in terms of when we're trying to put policies for older Australians? As you said, like did you say a third of people in the 55 above have got, you know, adult children at home? That seems like an incredibly large number.
No, it was of 55 to 74.
It's still a lot. Or 64
64.
is still a lot, isn't it?
So there's a large proportion there. And I think the thing is that those households don't only have, or they've got either adult children who haven't moved out or who are boomeranging back and forth, grandchildren, and then also dependent adult children as well. So that group, those factors really do shape the aspirations of that cohort of people. So I think what you said about there being really diverse needs across this group does make it very difficult to you can't come up with a policy solution or just one solution that's going to assist everybody. And that's where the diversity of housing options, the diversity of perhaps incentives for the private sector, for the home ownership sector, then start to come into play. The needs and aspirations of a single person household are definitely going to differ from those of a household with adult children perhaps are still living there.
How much of the issue is a matching one? I mean, you mentioned about the spare bedrooms aren't really spare, but you know, if there's a significant minority of people who are single elderly people with no children, I mean, maybe a 3-bedroom house does sound a bit like it's over the top in terms of trying to match up the housing type with the household type. I mean, there must have been studies done on this about how much the mismatch is the issue as opposed to the mismatch of aspirations. Yes, but there's also the mismatch of reality about what those households actually objectively need.
I'm not sure about. I don't feel like I can comment on what a household would objectively need, because a single person in a 3-bedroom home may have 2 grandchildren that regularly visit, and that's a big part of that person's life, and that's an important part of that person's life. And so I think that's where the underutilization is at odds with perhaps the lifestyle that people are leading. There is a mismatch in the housing supply against what the aspirations are. We definitely need more of that middle stock, where that perhaps some might be detached 2-bedroom homes, but some might be semi-detached 2-bedroom homes in those locations that provide the access to health and recreation and enable people to live the lifestyles that they want, but with a bit of garden, enough for your roses, or enough for to be able to have a cup of tea in the sun, but are located and have the right number of bedrooms. So all those aspects in the right spot. So there is a mismatch that exists, but it may not necessarily be to do with the utilisation.
I mean, I don't know how much you had to do or whether you've read the, you mentioned that your study, which was looking at older Australians, but there were 2 other studies looking at younger Australians and I guess the middle Australians in terms of their aspirations.
Midlife,
yeah. I mean, is the housing aspiration gap worse or particularly different for older versus younger Australians? I mean, because much of the current policy discussion is about how young people are unable to get into the housing market on the housing ladder, and there's all sorts of talk about, you know, intergenerational equity, if you like, and that basically oldies like us are being, you know, selfish by staying in our houses for too long and not allowing younger people to get on the housing ladder. So I'm just wondering whether, you know, has your study, is it basically designed to show that, look, it's not all, you know, not all roses for the older Australians, or is it more showing that there's difficulties at both ends of the spectrum? Because clearly the debate is about how are young people going to get on the housing ladder with high prices, high deposits required, etc.
There's that diversity across the board. So there are different cohorts at different ages are all having challenges and finding things difficult. There are younger people finding it difficult to get onto the housing ladder. There are also people in midlife where they are single person households or single parent households who have fallen out of home ownership. And so there's that cohort which is then coming through to the older age group as well, who are in the private rental sector. So there are similarities between the 3 and challenges that all 3 cohorts are experiencing.
I guess I'm just thinking about the interconnections, because only looking at older Australians' aspirations, it's not a self-contained sort of group. You know, what they do has knock-on effects for people below them, if you like, and younger than them.
Absolutely. And what happens in midlife and the experiences that we have in midlife then transfer to later life as well. And the same goes for those younger years. That also transfers to that midlife. So the opportunities and experiences that you get in those earlier years, and perhaps they may help you get into home ownership earlier, or into home ownership in those young years, is then going to have a flow-on effect through to those later years. So if we can assist people in those earlier years, the impact is going to be continuous for a long period of time.
Sure. That looks like our last question. What does the government do to get renters in social housing to downsize? I mean, I know we talked about downsizing, and maybe it's not always required, but in social housing, again, there's massive demand. So what does government do anything to get renters in social housing to downside, to free up bigger houses for people who need them? You know, a single senior might have a 3 or 4 bedroom house. So are there, but by the same token, as you mentioned, location's important. They've lived there for many years. They don't want to move from Mosman Park or wherever it is they live. So what are there active measures that governments undertake to try and get people in social housing to move from a larger house to a smaller house?
I believe at times there are. My research hasn't looked specifically at that, but I understand that there can sometimes be some manoeuvring, but it's difficult. Like, moving house is it's one of the hardest things that we do, and to ask someone who's older to do that, I think we have to, particularly with our private renters, we have to take that into account. So people do move. I don't know the extent to which they can choose, or whether they get a choice. We've got a lot of people in the private rental sector who have their names on the social housing wait list. So to either get community housing or state housing, that wait list is very, very, very long. So in that process, there might be matching that goes on as people move through that wait list.
But you're right. I mean, as you know, moving house is one of the biggest, dramas / traumas that anyone has to go through, and we all know about the problem of getting elderly parents to go into nursing homes and whatever, or into retirement villages. So there's no reason why a single older pensioner in a social housing is going to have any different. It's going to be just as traumatic for them. So that's an issue. Here we go. One last question that has come through. To what extent might older people's housing aspirations be limited by the current options they're aware of? Which is not just, you did mention how much searching is being done, and not many people, it's quite a lot, but more could be done. So how much is a knowledge thing as opposed to actually what's out there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because you can only really look for options that you know about. So if you don't know about a whole array of options, then how can you even go and start to consider them? So I think that housing knowledge, it plays a big part in shaping people's aspirations and shaping people's knowledge. And that's why the aspirations were about, when we asked about ideal housing, it was about those parts of housing that people were most likely to know about. But that knowledge, for me personally, I think that that's a very big, significant issue.
Thanks. Okay, well, look, we might call it a day there, Amity. Thank you very much for all your presentation. It's been very informative. Thank you, people in the audience, for sending through your questions. And as I said before, if you have colleagues who would like to have seen this talk but couldn't because they weren't available on a Friday afternoon, get them to come to our website in a few days' time. It usually takes a few days to get the thing edited and put up on our website, but it'll be up there along with Amity's her PowerPoints. And of course, there's those 2 reports that she's mentioned. I'm sure you can go to the Ahuri website and read those as well, and it's very worthwhile. So Amity, thanks very much, and hopefully good luck with the future research. Okay, so well done. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Okay, and just before everybody else goes, just reminding you, at next week's Curtin Corner, we have Professor Jaya Dantas from Curtin's School of Population Health, who'll be talking about COVID-19, vulnerability, variants and vaccines. Professor Dantas has been in the news quite a lot, doing commentary on COVID, and so she's a worldwide authority on this sort of stuff. So be very interesting presentation next week. So that's 4 o'clock next Friday on Curtin Corner. Hopefully we'll see you then, and we'll see you at another time down the track at other Curtin Corners. And in the meantime, have a great weekend. Thanks for joining us today. Goodbye.